He was born inside a palace modeled loosely on the forbidden city of Beijing, heir to a dynasty that had ruled for over a century. He would die 83 years later in a small rented apartment in Paris, so broke that his own funeral was arranged without the wife who had spent the last decades of his life beside him. In between, 3 different foreign powers would each, in turn, put a crown on his head and then take it away. This is the story of Bảo Đại, the last emperor of Vietnam, a man who inherited a throne nobody could actually sit on, and who spent his whole life discovering exactly how little that throne was worth. To understand how strange his life became, you have to start with the palace itself. He was born Nguyen Vinh Thu on October 22, 1913, inside the forbidden city in Hue, the innermost, most restricted section of the imperial compound. A place built specifically so that no one outside the royal household could enter it. His father was Emperor Cai Anh, a ruler who by then controlled almost nothing. Vietnam had been carved up by France decades earlier into 3 pieces: Cochinchina in the south, which France ruled directly as a colony, and Annam and Tonkin, which were technically protectorates still headed by a Vietnamese emperor. In practice, the emperor answered to a French official called the resident superior, and Cai Anh was, by the account of most historians who study the period, one of the more openly cooperative monarchs France ever had on that throne. So here's the first thing you need to sit with. Vinh Thu was never raised to actually rule anything. At 9 years old, his father sent him to Paris, where he enrolled at the Lycée Condorcet, the same school that had once educated the novelist Marcel Proust, under the guardianship of a former French colonial administrator named Jean-François Eugène Charles. The boy who would one day be called the keeper of a Vietnamese dynasty grew up speaking French, playing tennis, and living in a middle-class Parisian household that, by his own later account, felt more like a real family to him than the palace ever had. He came home briefly in 1924 for his father's 40th birthday celebrations. Then he went right back to France. And that's where he was in November 1925 when the telegram came. Emperor Cai Anh had died. Vinh Thu was 12 years old, thousands of miles from home, and he was now, by the ancient rules of dynastic succession, the 13th emperor of the Nguyen dynasty. He returned to Hue for a coronation in January 1926, took the reign name Bảo Đại, which translates roughly to keeper of greatness, and then almost immediately got back on a boat to France to keep finishing his education. A regency council ran the country in his name. For the next 6 years, Vietnam's emperor was quite literally a schoolboy in Paris. Now here's where it gets interesting, because when Bảo Đại finally returned to Hue for good in 1932, at 19 years old, he actually seemed to believe he could change something. He talked about modernizing the court, reforming education, giving the Vietnamese more of a voice in their own governance. He appointed a sharp, disciplined young Catholic Mandarin named Nguyen Diem as his Minister of the Interior, the very man who would, 22 years later, become the instrument of Bảo Đại final downfall. But when Diem tried to push through actual reforms, the French administration blocked him at every turn, and within months Diem resigned in frustration, humiliated and furious. Bảo Đại, watching his own minister get overruled by a colonial bureaucracy, absorbed a lesson he would apply for the rest of his reign. Don't fight battles you can't win. He stopped trying to reform anything. He started hunting instead. He built a retreat in the highland town of A Lat, took up golf and fast cars, and became known to the French press by a nickname that would follow him for the rest of his life: the Playboy Emperor. For most of the 1930s, that was more or less the whole story. A young monarch with real intelligence and genuine early ambition, quietly deciding that comfort was safer than conviction, but history about to letting him coast. In 1940, with France itself collapsed under Nazi occupation, Japan moved troops into French Indochina, at first allowing the existing French colonial government to keep functioning as a kind of puppet administration loyal to Vichy. Bảo Đại, already a figurehead under the French, now found himself a figurehead one layer deeper, watching Japan pull strings behind a French government that was itself taking orders from Tokyo. Then, on March 9, 1945, with the war clearly turning against them, the Japanese moved to eliminate the middleman entirely. In a single coordinated strike, they arrested the French colonial administration across Indochina, dismantling more than 80 years of French rule in a matter of hours. 2 days later, on March 11, 1945, Japan pushed Bảo Đại to declare Vietnamese independence. For the first time since the 1880s, there was no French treaty standing over the Vietnamese throne. Bảo Đại genuinely seemed to believe, at least for a moment, that something real had shifted. He announced the end of the old treaties with France and appointed a new prime minister, the historian Tran Truong Kim, to head a government that called itself, officially, the Empire of Vietnam. It was not independence. It was a Japanese client state, assembled in the final months of a war Japan was already losing, designed to keep some kind of order in Indochina while the rest of the Japanese empire came apart. And while Bảo Đại was celebrating a sovereignty that barely existed, something far more consequential was happening in the countryside. Something the emperor, sealed inside the palace at Hue, appears to have understood only dimly. Since late 1944, northern and central Vietnam had been sliding into one of the worst famines in the country's modern history. Japanese occupation forces had been requisitioning rice for military use and forcing farmers to convert paddies to industrial crops like jute, even as French colonial mismanagement had already strained the food supply. Historians still argue about exactly how many people died. Official wartime reports from 20 northern provinces put the toll at roughly 380,000. A French military estimate that autumn put it closer to 500,000, and Ho Chi Minh himself, in his later independence speech, cited a figure of 2 million. Most historians who have studied the archival record since then land somewhere between 1 and 2 million deaths in the space of a few months. In the town of Phat Diem, a farmer named I Ho was one of the very few in his area to survive. Decades later, in oral history interviews collected by researchers, he described watching Japanese authorities seize what little grain remained in his village. People walked from town to town searching for food that no longer existed anywhere nearby. And the man who was, on paper, the sovereign ruler of the country where this was happening was hosting a government installed by the very occupying power that was worsening the crisis. That gap between the throne and the suffering happening in its name is the thing that made everything after March 1945 possible. Because when Japan surrendered on August 14, 1945, the fragile arrangement Bảo Đại had inherited collapsed overnight. A coalition of nationalist and communist forces called the Viet Minh, led by Ho Chi Minh, had spent years building support in exactly the rural areas the famine had devastated. In the space of about 2 weeks, in what's now called the August Revolution, Viet Minh forces moved into Hanoi, then Saigon, then almost every major population center in the country, seizing government buildings and raising their flag. Then they turned Hue. A telegram arrived at the imperial palace. It gave Bảo Đại roughly 12 hours to abdicate. His own imperial guard had already stood by while revolutionary flags went up outside the citadel walls. He had no army willing to fight for him, no French protection left, according to his own later account. A clear memory of what had happened to European monarchs who tried to resist revolutions by force. On August 25, 1945, he agreed to step down. 5 days later, on August 30, a formal ceremony was held at the Ngo Mun Gate of the imperial city. Bảo Đại appeared one last time in imperial robes and handed over the dynasty's sacred imperial seal and sword to representatives of the new government. In his abdication statement, he said something close to this, that he would rather live as an ordinary citizen of a free country than sit as emperor over one that wasn't. It's one of the most quoted lines in modern Vietnamese history, and for a moment, it made a man who had spent most of his reign avoiding hard choices look almost heroic. The Nguyen dynasty, founded in 1802, was over. He was now officially citizen Vinh Thuy. What happened to that seal and that sword afterward is genuinely disputed. Some accounts, difficult to independently verify, claim the objects were eventually sold off decades later. Others say their fate remains unresolved. Either way, the two most sacred physical symbols of Vietnamese royal authority essentially vanish from the reliable historical record after 1945, which feels, in hindsight, like a fairly accurate metaphor for what was about to happen to the man who once carried them. Ho Chi Minh, shrewd enough to see the symbolic value of the moment, invited the former emperor to stay on as supreme advisor to the new Democratic Republic of Vietnam. Bảo accepted. It changed nothing about his actual influence. Within months, with French forces beginning to return to reclaim the colony, Ho Chi Minh sent him on a diplomatic mission to China. Partly real diplomacy, partly a convenient way to get a potential rival figurehead out of the country. Bảo never went back to that government. He resurfaced in Hong Kong in 1946, and for the next several years he became something closer to a rumor than a ruler. Nightclubs, casinos, a revolving cast of companions, and, when his own money ran out, discreet subsidies from French intelligence, who understood something the former emperor may not have fully grasped yet, that he was about to become useful again. Because by late 1946, France and the Viet Minh were at open war, the beginning of what's now called the First Indochina War. And France needed a Vietnamese face for its side of that war that wasn't a communist revolutionary. There was only one man in the world with any remaining claim to Vietnamese royal legitimacy, and he was sitting in a Hong Kong hotel room. The French called it, without much subtlety, the Bảo Đại solution. Bring the former emperor back, install him as head of a nominally independent Vietnamese state, and use him to split nationalist sentiment away from Ho Chi Minh. Bảo Đại negotiated for nearly 2 years, pushing for real sovereignty. What he got in the March 1949 Élysée Accords was independence in name only. France kept control of defense and foreign affairs. On June 14, 1949, the state of Vietnam was formally created, reuniting Cochin China, Annam and Tonkin under Bảo Đại as head of state. Years later he admitted, in blunter terms than the French would have liked, that what people called the Bảo Đại solution was really just a French solution wearing his name. He spent most of the next 5 years exactly the way you'd expect by now, at resorts in Eilat and on the French Riviera, while pro-French appointees ran the actual government and the war with the Viet Minh ground on. And that war reached its breaking point in the spring of 1954, at a remote valley in the northwest calledIen Bien Phu. Vietnamese forces under General Nguyen surrounded a heavily fortified French garrison and besieged it for 56 days, digging trenches closer and closer under artillery cover the French couldn't suppress. On May 7, 1954, the position collapsed. French casualties numbered in the thousands, with thousands more taken prisoner. Viet Minh losses were higher still. It was the most humiliating defeat in the history of French colonial warfare, and it ended, for good, French control of Indochina. The Geneva Accords that followed split Vietnam at the 17th parallel. A communist north under Ho Chi Minh, and a southern state, still nominally headed by Bảo Đại, that was supposed to hold national reunification elections within 2 years. Those elections never happened. And this is where the man Bảo Đại had once fired as his Minister of the Interior comes back into the story. Under pressure from the United States, which had become deeply invested in stopping the Communism in Southeast Asia, Bảo Đại, spending nearly all his time in France by this point, appointed Nguyen Diem as Prime Minister of South Vietnam in June 1954. Diem did not time. Over the following year, he crushed the criminal syndicate that controlled Saigon's police, subdued the private armies of 2 powerful religious sects, and built a personal power base run largely through his younger brother, Nguyen. Once Diem felt secure, he turned on the one obstacle left standing between him and total control: the man who had appointed him. On October 23, 1955, Diem staged a referendum asking voters to choose between keeping Bảo Đại as head of state or creating a republic under Diem. It wasn't close to fair. Campaigning for Bảo Đại was effectively banned. Government-controlled newspapers ran degrading cartoons attacking him personally. Police went door to door warning people what would happen if they didn't vote the right way. When the ballots were counted, Diem claimed victory with 98.2% of the vote. And in Saigon alone, his tally exceeds 605,000, in a city with roughly 450,000 registered voters. The math didn't work, and nobody in Diem's government bothered to explain it. 3 days later, Diem declared the Republic of Vietnam and named himself its first president. Bảo Đại was finished. The Vietnamese monarchy, in every sense that mattered, was over for good. He went back to France and stayed there for more than 4 decades. The wealth thinned out over the years. No more palaces, no more French government stipend worth much of anything, just a modest apartment at 29 Rue Fresnel in Paris's 16th arrondissement. His first wife, Empress Nam Phuong, a French-educated Catholic he'd married in 1934, and with whom he'd had 5 children, had already relocated to France separately years earlier, worn down by a marriage strained by his constant infidelities. She died in 1963, largely out of the public eye. 9 years later, in 1972, Bảo Đại married a Frenchwoman more than 30 years his junior named Monique Baudot, who would remain with him, eventually adopting the self-styled title of Empress for the rest of his life. Here's a question worth sitting with for a second. What do you do with a title that means everything symbolically and nothing practically? Bảo Đại answer mostly was to let other people answer it for him. In 1972, he allowed North Vietnam's government to briefly use him in a propaganda broad denouncing the American military presence in the South. One more faction, one more borrowed use of a name that had already been borrowed by the French, the Japanese, and the Americans before it. He watched the rest of the Vietnam War unfold from Paris. When Saigon fell in April 1975, and the country was reunified under communist rule, the state that had once, however nominally, called him its head simply ceased to exist. He spent his final 2 decades in near-total obscurity. In 1980, he published a memoir in French titled Le Dragon d'Anam, a title later reused in Vietnamese for an edition published within the diaspora community in California. In 1982, he traveled to visit Vietnamese exile communities in the United States, a quiet tour that drew some interest from people who still remembered the old court but produced no political statement of any consequence. In 1988, in what seems to have been a private and personal decision rather than a political one, he converted from Buddhism to Roman Catholicism and was baptized under the name John Robert. At 5 in the morning on July 31, 1997, Bảo Đại died at the Val de Grace Military Hospital in Paris. He was 83 years old. His funeral was attended by the children from his first marriage. His widow, by most accounts, was not present, having grown estranged from his family in his final years. He was buried at the Cimetière de Passy in Paris, not in Hue, not anywhere near the Perfume River his ancestors had ruled beside for a century and a half, but in a French cemetery under a French baptismal name, the final resting place of a man who spent more of his life in France than in the country he'd technically ruled. And yet the place that made him, Hue itself, didn't disappear along with the dynasty. In December 1993, UNESCO designated the complex of Hue monuments as Vietnam's first World Heritage. And in the decades since, the government has invested in restoring the Citadel, the Forbidden Purple City, and the royal tombs that had been badly damaged during years of war. Millions of tourists now walk through the same Ngo Mun Gate where Bảo Đại handed over his seal and sword in 1945. The dynasty that a revolution erased has, in a strange way, been partly resurrected as heritage tourism, preserved, polished, and completely disconnected from any actual political power. If you think about it, is roughly the same arrangement Bảo Đại himself for almost his entire adult life. So what do you actually call a man like this? It's easy, and not entirely wrong, to call him weak, a monarch who spent lavishly while 1 million or more of his people starved, who retreated to golf courses and hunting lodges when his country needed someone to stay and fight for it. But it's worth remembering that he was handed a throne at 12 years old that had already been hollowed out for decades before he ever touched it. raised by the very colonial power that had done the hollowing, and then handed back to a country he'd barely lived in and expected to lead it through the most violent century in its history. Every single time he tried to push for real change, as a young reformer in the 1930s, as head of state in the 1950s, the people who actually held power made sure nothing changed. Every faction that used him, the French, the Japanese, the Americans, discarded him the moment he stopped being useful to them. None of that erases the choices he made freely. The mistresses, the years spent in French casinos while his country starved and then burned. But maybe the more honest way to look at Bảo Đại isn't as a villain or a hero. He was something rarer and in its own way sadder. A man who spent his entire life standing at the exact center of Vietnam's collision with the modern world, and who never once got to decide anything that happened there. If you'd been born into that palace instead of him, raised to rule a country you barely knew, propped up by whichever foreign power needed you that decade, do you think you'd have fought harder than he did? Or do you think you'd have made the same quiet trade he made, comfort for consequence? Let me know what you think in the comments, and if this kind of deep dive into the people history left behind is something you want more of, consider subscribing. It genuinely helps.